Most people think discipline is a personality trait. They think some men are born with it, the way some men are born tall, or fast, or naturally gifted at things that other men have to work twice as hard to reach. They look at the man who wakes at 5 every morning without an alarm, who trains without needing to be pushed, who keeps his word without being reminded, and they tell themselves that man is simply built differently, that somewhere in his genetics, or his upbringing, or some formative experience they will never have access to, there is a source of willpower that they were not given. This belief is one of the most expensive lies in a man's life, because it removes the entire subject from the category of things he can actually do something about, and places it permanently in the category of things he either has or does not have. And a man who believes that cannot change his relationship to discipline, because he has already decided the relationship is fixed. But discipline is not a personality trait. It is not a gift. It is not a mysterious quality that some men possess and others simply lack. It is a neurological condition. And like most neurological conditions, it responds to training. This is not a metaphor. This is not motivational language designed to make you feel temporarily better about your chances. This is the actual mechanism documented by neuroscience, studied across decades of research, and consistently ignored by the motivational industry because it is far less sellable than the idea that some people simply have what it takes and others do not. What discipline actually does to your brain is concrete, measurable, and available to any man willing to understand how the system works before trying to operate it. So let us start at the beginning. Your brain is not a fixed object. Every thought you think, every decision you make, every habit you repeat or break, every moment of resistance you push through or surrender to is physically reshaping the structure of your brain, not symbolically, not as a figure of speech. The neurons that fire together wire together, and the patterns you repeat become over time the literal architecture of the mind you are operating with. This is called neuroplasticity, and it is the most important fact about the human brain that most men have never been taught to take seriously. What it means practically is that the brain you have right now is not the brain you were born with. It is the brain you have built through repetition. Every habit of distraction you have practiced has reinforced the neural pathways that make distraction easier. Every time you have abandoned a commitment before completion, you have strengthened the circuitry that makes abandonment the path of least resistance. Every morning you have chosen the snooze button has made choosing the snooze button slightly more automatic than choosing to rise. None of this was conscious. None of it was chosen in any meaningful sense. It simply happened because the brain is always optimizing for what it has been asked to do most often, and what it has been asked to do most often has been, for most men, the easier thing. This is not a moral judgment. It is a mechanical description of how the system functions. The brain does not distinguish between a good habit and a bad habit. It does not reward you for choosing difficulty and penalize you for choosing ease. It simply strengthens whatever pathway you use most frequently, and gradually, across weeks and months and years of repetition, those pathways become the default operating mode of your mind. This is why a man who has spent 5 years choosing distraction over focus finds focusing so physically uncomfortable. The neural infrastructure for sustained concentration has atrophied from disuse, while the infrastructure for fragmented attention has been developed into a highway. The discomfort of trying to focus is not weakness of character. It is the experience of using a pathway that has not been maintained, struggling against the pull of one that has. Understanding this changes the entire conversation about discipline, because it means the question is not whether you are disciplined enough. The question is what you have been training your brain to do, without realizing you were training it at all. Now here is where the neuroscience becomes genuinely interesting and genuinely useful. The part of your brain most relevant to discipline is the prefrontal cortex. It sits at the very front of the brain, directly behind your forehead, and it is responsible for what neuroscientists call executive function, the cluster of abilities that includes planning, impulse control, decision-making, the capacity to delay gratification, and the ability to hold a long-term goal in mind while resisting the short-term pull of comfort or distraction. The prefrontal cortex is, in evolutionary terms, the newest part of the human brain. It is what distinguishes human cognition from animal cognition in the most meaningful ways. It is the part of you capable of looking 40 years into the future and making a decision today in service of that future, even when every other part of your brain is demanding immediate relief. It is also, not coincidentally, the part of your brain that develops last. It does not reach full maturity until a man is in his mid-20s, which means that during the years when most of the foundational habits of a life are being established, The primary tool for resisting bad habits and building good ones is still under construction. This is not an excuse, it is context. A man who understands that his prefrontal cortex is a muscle, capable of development through use and atrophy through neglect, has a fundamentally different relationship with discipline than a man who believes willpower is simply something he has or does not have in fixed quantity. Because here is what actually happens in the brain of a man who practices discipline consistently over time. The prefrontal cortex literally grows, not as metaphor. The gray matter density in the prefrontal cortex measurably increases in people who maintain consistent discipline practices. The neural connections between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, the older, more impulsive part of the brain responsible for immediate emotional reactions and the pursuit of instant gratification, strengthen and become more efficient. What this means practically is that the disciplined man is not fighting his impulses with more willpower than the undisciplined man. He has simply built a brain in which the prefrontal cortex has a louder voice in the conversation between long-term thinking and short-term desire. The impulse is still present. The craving for ease is still real. But the circuitry that evaluates that craving against a longer time horizon and chooses accordingly has been developed to a point where it can win that conversation more reliably, more automatically, with less conscious effort than it required at the beginning. This is why discipline gets easier with consistent practice, and not in the way most people assume. It does not get easier because you become indifferent to discomfort. It gets easier because the neural pathway for choosing discomfort over ease has been strengthened to the point where it operates with less resistance. The man who has trained consistently for 3 years does not feel the morning cold less than the man on his first week. But he has built the neurological infrastructure that makes rising into the cold the automatic response, rather than something requiring a daily act of heroism. There is a second mechanism worth understanding, because it changes how you think about the early stages of building discipline, which are always the hardest and the most likely to produce the kind of failure that convinces a man the whole enterprise is beyond him. When you begin a new discipline practice, before the neural pathways have been reinforced, before the prefrontal cortex has been trained to win the conversation reliably, the brain experiences the effort of discipline the same way it experiences physical pain. This is not a figure of speech. The neural circuits involved in self-regulation draw on the same cognitive resources as other demanding mental tasks, and those resources are finite within any given day. This is why willpower feels depleted by the end of a difficult day, why the man who has exercised intense self-control in the morning is more likely to falter by evening, why the period of establishing a new habit is genuinely exhausting, in a way that the man practicing it may not be able to explain but can certainly feel. The motivational industry has typically responded to this fact by telling men to try harder, to want it more, to dig deeper. This advice is not wrong, exactly, but it addresses the symptom rather than the mechanism. A man trying harder against a depleted willpower reserve is fighting a losing battle against his own neurology. And losing that battle repeatedly produces something more damaging than simple failure. It produces the conviction that he is the kind of man who cannot sustain discipline, which becomes, through repetition, the very neural pattern he is trying to break. The correct response to this mechanism is not trying harder. It is understanding the resource and managing it strategically, which means something specific and practical. The discipline you are trying to build needs to be practiced when the prefrontal cortex is at full capacity, not when it has been depleted by hours of decisions and demands. This is why the consistent finding across research into high-performing individuals is that they protect their mornings with an intensity that looks, to people who do not understand the neuroscience, like obsession or rigidity. It is neither. It is resource management. The man who trains his most important discipline practice in the first hours of the day, before the cognitive load of ordinary life has begun to accumulate, is not being inflexible. He is being strategic about the only neurological resource he actually controls. There is a third mechanism, perhaps the most underappreciated of all, because it operates below the level where most men think about discipline at all. Every time you complete a discipline practice, every time you do the thing you committed to doing, despite the resistance, despite the discomfort, despite the voice in your head suggesting an easier alternative, your brain releases a small amount of dopamine. Not the large dopamine hit of a novel reward or a completed goal, something smaller and more targeted than that. A signal that says, in the language the brain actually uses, that action was consistent with what this system has decided to prioritize. Over time, this signal begins to shift the dopamine architecture of the brain itself. The man who has practiced consistent discipline for months begins to find that the practice itself carries a reward signal. The discomfort becomes familiar in a way that is not neutral but is slightly positive, because the brain has learned that this discomfort precedes something it values. The resistance at the beginning of a training session or a focused work block is no longer experienced purely as an obstacle. It is experienced as the beginning of something the brain knows, from accumulated evidence, that it will be rewarded for completing. This is the mechanism behind what people sometimes describe as learning to love the process. It is not a mystical transformation of character. It is dopamine architecture changing in response to consistent experience. The brain is learning, through repetition, to associate the discomfort of discipline with a reward signal. And that association, once established, makes the discomfort pull forward rather than push back. This takes time, months, not days. The early weeks of any discipline practice exist before this architecture has been established, which is exactly why they are so difficult and why they produce such high rates of abandonment. A man who understands this is not surprised by the difficulty of the early weeks. He is not interpreting that difficulty as evidence the practice is not working, or that he is not built for it. He is recognizing it as the expected experience of a brain that has not yet built the architecture to reward what he is asking it to do, and he continues anyway, because he understands that continuing is exactly what builds the architecture. That understanding is itself a form of discipline. And it is built, like everything else in this conversation, through the repetition of choosing the right interpretation when the wrong one is more immediately comforting. There is something else the neuroscience reveals about discipline that almost no one talks about, because it complicates the simple narrative of willpower as a purely mental resource. The brain and the body are not separate systems operating in parallel. They are one system, and the state of the body directly determines the capacity of the prefrontal cortex to function at the level discipline requires. Sleep deprivation reduces prefrontal cortex function measurably and dramatically. A man operating on 5 hours of sleep does not simply feel less disciplined. His brain is neurologically less capable of the executive function that discipline depends on. The circuits responsible for impulse control, long-term decision-making, and resisting immediate gratification are running at reduced capacity, in exactly the same way that a muscle performs at reduced capacity after insufficient recovery. This matters because most men who struggle with discipline also, not coincidentally, struggle with sleep. They stay up too late, compromise recovery, and then interpret the resulting difficulty with self-regulation as a character flaw rather than a neurological consequence of inadequate restoration. They try to solve a recovery problem with a willpower solution, which is the equivalent of trying to solve a nutrition deficiency through sheer determination. The same relationship exists with chronic stress. Elevated cortisol, the hormone produced by the adrenal system under sustained stress, directly impairs prefrontal cortex function while simultaneously activating the limbic system, the very part of the brain that produces impulsive, comfort-seeking behavior. A man under significant chronic stress is not weaker than other men. He is operating with a brain in which the neurological balance of power has shifted away from the systems that produce discipline and toward the systems that produce avoidance. Understanding this does not eliminate responsibility, it clarifies it. Because a man who understands these mechanisms knows that managing sleep, managing stress, managing the physical inputs to the brain he is trying to develop is not self-indulgence. It is infrastructure maintenance. It is the prerequisite work that makes everything else possible. The highest performers in any domain, across every study that has looked at the question carefully, do not succeed through superior willpower applied to inferior neurological conditions. They succeed, in large part, because they manage the conditions under which their brain operates with the same deliberateness they bring to the practices they are trying to build. This is the full picture of what discipline actually adds to the brain. Not a simple story of strong men refusing to quit. A complex neurological process of building infrastructure, managing resources, establishing reward architecture, and maintaining the physical conditions under which the entire system can function at the level a serious life requires. The man who understands this is not looking for motivation, he is managing a system. And systems, maintained correctly, produce results that motivation alone never reliably could. What that means for how a man actually builds it, maintains it, and what happens to him at the deepest levels of identity and self-perception when he does. Because the neuroscience does not end at the mechanism. It extends all the way into who a man becomes through the practice of discipline over time. And that becoming is more radical, more complete, and more permanent than almost anyone who has not experienced it would expect. Let us start with something that sounds simple, but carries enormous practical weight. Discipline changes what you notice. A brain that has been trained through consistent discipline practice does not experience the world the same way an undisciplined brain does. Not because the external world has changed, because the brain's attentional systems have been reconfigured by repetition to notice different things and assign different values to what it notices. The undisciplined brain has been trained, through years of choosing comfort, to notice primarily what is immediately rewarding or immediately threatening. It scans for pleasure and pain in the present tense. It is exquisitely sensitive to anything that offers relief from discomfort and highly motivated to move toward it. This is not weakness. It is an attentional system shaped by what it has been asked to prioritize. The disciplined brain has been trained to notice something different, not instead of the present tense reward signal, but alongside it and increasingly above it. It has developed, through repetition, a heightened sensitivity to the relationship between present action and future consequence. It notices where the undisciplined brain does not. The cost of a moment's ease on the trajectory of the next week, the next year, the next decade. It has built the neurological infrastructure that makes the future feel real in the present moment, rather than abstract and theoretical. This is not a philosophical difference. It is a structural one. The man whose prefrontal cortex has been developed through consistent discipline practice is literally perceiving a richer version of reality than the man who has not, in the specific sense that he can hold more of the temporal consequence of a decision in mind while making it. This matters enormously in practice because most of the decisions that shape a life are not dramatic. They are small, repeated, apparently inconsequential choices made dozens of times daily. The decision to begin the work session or delay it by one more scroll. The decision to keep the commitment made to yourself last night or renegotiate it now that morning has arrived and the commitment feels less urgent than the warmth of inaction. The decision to say the true thing in the conversation or the comfortable thing. To train on the day your body resists or give it the rest it is requesting even though the request is coming from laziness rather than genuine need. A brain shaped by undisciplined repetition makes these decisions primarily on the basis of what the present moment is demanding. A brain shaped by disciplined repetition makes them with access to a longer horizon, which means it makes them differently, more often, in the direction of what it has decided matters, rather than what it happens to feel like in the specific instant of the choice. This is the compounding effect of discipline that no one can see from the outside during the early months, and that becomes startlingly visible over years. It is not primarily that the disciplined man works harder. It is that the disciplined man has built a brain that makes better decisions automatically, in the ordinary moments that no one is watching and no one applauds. And those better decisions, accumulated across thousands of ordinary days, produce a life that looks, to people who only observe the outcome and not the mechanism, like the result of extraordinary talent or exceptional luck. Now let us address something that sits directly beneath all of this, and rarely gets named clearly. The practice of discipline, when maintained consistently over time, fundamentally changes a man's relationship with himself. This is not a small thing. The relationship a man has with himself, the degree to which he trusts his own word, believes in his own capacity, feels that the gap between who he currently is and who he senses he could become, is one he is actively closing rather than indefinitely deferring, is the primary determinant of almost everything else in his life. Most men live with a low level of chronic self-distrust that they have never examined clearly because they have never named it. They make commitments and break them quietly. They tell themselves they will begin and do not begin. They set the alarm for the morning they intend to rise differently and silence it when it arrives. Each of these moments, individually, is small. The cumulative effect, across months and years of this pattern, is the installation of a deep and persistent belief that the man's word, even to himself, does not mean what it says. This is corrosive in a way that goes far beyond productivity or habit formation. A man who does not trust himself cannot fully pursue anything that matters to him, because every pursuit requires, at some point, the willingness to bet on himself. To believe, without guarantee, that the version of himself capable of doing the thing is real and not merely theoretical. And a man who has spent years watching himself break commitments has no experiential evidence that this belief is warranted. He has only the hope that this time will be different. And hope without evidence is a thin foundation for anything serious. Discipline changes this directly and specifically. Every time a man keeps a commitment to himself, Every time he does what he said he was going to do, even when he did not feel like doing it, he generates a small piece of evidence. Evidence that his word means what it says. Evidence that the version of himself capable of sustained effort is not imaginary. Evidence that the gap between the man he currently is and the man he could be is not fixed. This evidence accumulates. Slowly at first, invisibly beneath the level where he can easily point to it and say this is what changed. But it accumulates. And after enough of it has been generated, something shifts in the way the man carries himself that has nothing to do with external results. He begins to move with a quality of certainty that was not there before, not arrogance, not performance. A quiet internal conviction that he can be relied upon by himself when it matters. This is what confidence actually is at its root. Not the loud display-oriented version that most people perform. The quiet version that comes from having been tested internally, in private against resistance repeatedly, and having passed the test often enough that passing is now the expectation rather than the hope. Neuroscience supports this at the level of mechanism. The consistent practice of self-regulation activates reward circuits that reinforce the behavior and simultaneously build what researchers call self-efficacy, the specific belief in one's own capacity to produce intended outcomes through sustained effort. Self-efficacy is not a feeling. It is a cognitive model, a brain's working theory of what a particular person is capable of, built entirely from the accumulated evidence of past behavior. A man who breaks his commitments consistently is building a self-efficacy model that predicts failure. A man who keeps them consistently is building a model that predicts success. And these models are not merely psychological, they are neurological. They shape perception, they influence decision-making, they alter the brain's initial assessment of whether a new challenge is within range or beyond it. The man with high self-efficacy and the man with low self-efficacy can face the identical challenge and have fundamentally different neurological responses to it because their brains are drawing on fundamentally different evidence about what is possible for a person like them. This is why discipline is not simply a productivity tool. It is an identity-building process. And the identity it builds over consistent time is one of the most valuable things a man can possess, because unlike external achievements, which can be lost, it lives inside him and cannot be taken by circumstance. There is one more dimension of this that deserves direct attention, because it addresses the question that sits underneath everything else in this conversation. The question of what happens when discipline breaks down, because it will break down, not as evidence of fundamental inadequacy, as the normal expected behavior of a neurological system under varying conditions. Every man who maintains discipline over long periods of time encounters periods where the system fails, where the accumulated stress, the unforeseen disruption, the illness, the grief, the season of difficulty that was not planned for and did not wait for permission, interrupts the practices that have been keeping the brain in the state discipline produces. What separates men who recover from these interruptions quickly from men who allow them to become permanent is not, as is commonly believed, the intensity of their original discipline. It is the speed of return. The brain maintains the neural pathways built by disciplined practice for a significant time after the practice itself is interrupted. The architecture does not dissolve overnight. It fades gradually, the way a path through grass grows over slowly, rather than vanishing the moment foot traffic stops. This means that a man returning to a disciplined practice, after an interruption of days or even weeks, is returning to infrastructure that has been partially maintained rather than starting from scratch. The critical error most men make in this moment is treating the interruption as evidence that the discipline was never real, that the version of themselves that maintained it was temporary, and the current version is the true one. This interpretation is neurologically false and functionally catastrophic, because it prevents the return that would restore the system fastest. The correct interpretation, the one that matches what the neuroscience actually shows, is that an interrupted discipline practice is a maintained neural pathway experiencing reduced use, and that resuming the practice will restore full function more quickly than the original building required, because the infrastructure already exists and simply needs reactivation. This is not self-justification. It is an accurate description of how the brain actually works, and a man who understands it returns to his practice after disruption without the weight of believing he is starting over. He is not starting over, he is returning. And returning done quickly and without self-punishment for the interruption is the fastest path back to the neurological state that discipline produces. The final truth about what discipline does to your brain is the one that contains all the others. It does not simply change what you are able to do. It changes what you are. Not your fixed nature, which was never as fixed as you were told, but the operating version of yourself, the brain you are running your life from, the attentional systems that determine what you notice and what you ignore, the self-efficacy model that shapes what you believe is possible before you have even attempted anything. Discipline, practiced consistently over time, builds a brain that is genuinely different from the one that began the practice. More capable of sustained attention, more resistant to impulsive decision-making, more attuned to long-term consequence, more able to trust its own word, more equipped to return from disruption without treating the disruption as a verdict on its nature. That brain is available to any man willing to understand the mechanism and work the system with the patience the neuroscience shows is required. Not because he is special, because the brain responds to repetition. It always has. The only question is what you have been asking it to repeat. But there is a practical question that sits just beneath the theory, and it deserves a direct answer. Because understanding the neuroscience of discipline is useful, but only if it translates into something actionable in the specific life of the specific man reading or listening to this. The question is, where does a man who understands all of this actually begin? The answer, consistently supported by both the neuroscience and the accumulated evidence of men who have successfully rebuilt their discipline from a low baseline, is always smaller than expected. And this is not a concession to weakness. It is an application of the mechanism. The prefrontal cortex is developed through successful acts of self-regulation, not heroic ones. A man who commits to something enormous and fails to sustain it has not exercised his self-regulation capacity. He has exercised his planning capacity and his collapse capacity. The neural pathway that was supposed to be strengthened was not used, because the commitment exceeded what the current infrastructure could support before it was developed enough to handle it. The man who commits to something small, genuinely small, smaller than feels meaningful, and keeps that commitment without exception, is doing something neurologically different from the man who commits to something large and intermittently honors it. He is building the prefrontal cortex pathway under conditions where success is likely, generating the dopamine reward signal consistently, producing evidence for his self-efficacy model, and creating the foundational architecture that larger commitments will eventually be able to run on. This is why the advice to start ridiculously small is not weakness management. It is intelligent system design. A man who commits to 5 minutes of uninterrupted focused work every morning and keeps that commitment every morning for 60 days without exception has done something more neurologically valuable than the man who commits to 4 hours of deep work and manages it sporadically. The first man has built infrastructure. The second man has demonstrated ambition and produced inconsistent results, which in neurological terms means he has strengthened both the pathway for sustained effort and the pathway for abandonment, leaving the outcome unclear. There is also the question of environment, which the neuroscience treats as seriously as the practice itself. The brain does not make decisions in a vacuum. It makes them in response to cues in the environment, and those cues have been shown to activate both disciplined and undisciplined patterns of behavior, with remarkable reliability and with minimal conscious involvement. A man trying to build a disciplined practice in an environment full of cues for distraction, ease, and avoidance is fighting the environment's influence on his own neural circuitry every single time he tries to practice. This is a winnable fight, but it is harder than it needs to be. The disciplined management of environment, removing the phone from the bedroom, keeping the training equipment visible and accessible, designing the physical space of the morning to cue the behaviors being built rather than the ones being escaped, is not obsession or inflexibility. It is the intelligent use of a neurological fact. Environmental cues activate neural pathways before conscious decision-making has a chance to intervene. A man who designs his environment to support his discipline practice is not relying on willpower to overcome his environment. He is removing the environmental triggers that his undisciplined pathways respond to, and replacing them with triggers his developing discipline pathways can respond to instead. Over time, as the disciplined pathways are strengthened and the environmental cues consistently activate them, the behavior becomes automatic rather than effortful. This is the endpoint that the entire neurological process is moving toward, and it is worth naming clearly because it reframes the entire project. The goal of disciplined practice is not a life of permanent effort and resistance. It is a life in which the behaviors that serve the man's values and long-term goals have become automatic, running on infrastructure strong enough that they no longer require the daily expenditure of willpower to sustain. This state is not permanent self-denial. It is paradoxically a form of freedom. The man who no longer has to fight himself every morning, to rise, to train, to focus, to keep his word, has not become a machine. He has built a brain in which the behaviors that align with who he has decided to be are no longer in conflict with his immediate impulses, because his immediate impulses have been gradually reshaped by the very practice of overriding them. The discomfort of discipline is not permanent. The architecture it builds is. That is the full answer to what discipline actually does to your brain. It builds something. Not a feeling, not a reputation, not a temporary state of elevated motivation. A structure, a physical neurological structure that changes the man operating with it at the most fundamental level available to change. And unlike almost everything else a man can pursue, this structure cannot be bought, cannot be inherited, cannot be given by anyone else under any circumstances. It is built only one way, through the repetition of doing what you said you would do, especially in the moments when you did not feel like doing it, until the brain that shows up to make the next decision is genuinely different from the one that made the first. That is the work. Not glamorous, not visible to anyone else during the building, but permanent in a way that almost nothing else a man can build in his life will be.